I don't know why, but I couldn't stop shaking. Even with the wool blanket coiled around my body tightly, it smelled sterile and flat like a hospital. I wrung the stuffed animal they gave me in my pale hands. The bear's patrol uniform was already wrinkling with every flex of my digits. The ever-present ticking of the solitary clock made my head pound. Every now and again, I could almost hear muffled voices from behind the two-way mirror. The hanging light above me hummed like a faulty fridge. I wasn't sure why these normally permissible sounds couldn't leave my focus. Without any warning, something knocked softly from the other side of the plain door. It opened slowly, like whoever was on the other side was afraid to make too much noise. I expected a detective with dead eyes to step into the room, but a lithe-shaped stepped into the interrogation room. Her heels clicked on the concrete as she strode over to the table. The scent of detergent and jasmine drifted around her. I scrutinized her for the presence of a badge or a gun, but I couldn't see either. I couldn't really get a good look at her. The harsh light above me silhouetted the strange woman. I expected to hear a pointed question, but instead, she only made a simple request. "Clyde, is it alright if I sit for a bit and ask you a few questions?" At first, I only answered with a shrug. "Fine." She sat down across from me in the metallic chair. The first thing that struck me about her was how familiar she almost looked. She dressed more like a teacher or a librarian. Her already soft face was made kinder by her rounded glasses. She wore an open lavender sweater that looked hand-stitched to me. A lanyard with some kind of ID snaked itself around her neck. The writing was almost illegible, and the printed pictures lacked any color altogether. "I'm Mrs. O'Neill, but you can just call me Nora." She set a plain, steaming mug on the table silently and dug into her purse. She produced a baggie of pastel-colored marshmallow twists and added a few before sliding them across the table. I stared at the mug briefly, watching the bright colors melt away into the dark liquid. I set the bear down on my lap and held the mug in my palms. For some reason, the almost burning heat of the hot drink stopped the shaking, just a little. Are you a cop?" I asked hesitantly. She shook her head and offered a disarming smile. "No. My job is to work with kids like you and make sure they're safe." My chest tightened at the phrasing she used about what would probably come next in my situation. "Is my mom in trouble?" I asked, dreading what she would answer. "No, Clyde. No one's in trouble, but..." She set out a gray and black tape recorder onto the bolted table before continuing. "I do need to remember this chat between us." She pressed the record button on the cassette and leaned back in her seat. The woman crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap almost politely. I didn't know what to say. I brought the bear closer to my body, squeezing until my knuckles turned white. Mrs. O'Neill asked her first question carefully. "Did someone try to hurt you tonight?" I didn't want to answer. I just wanted to go back, before it all went wrong, before everything unraveled under my feet. I thought back to the last day at school before spring break. Despite it being a shorter day because of Friday's presence, I still felt antsy. I couldn't sit still no matter how hard I tried. When I looked around, I realized swiftly that I wasn't the only one ailed with this restlessness. When the bell for lunch finally rang, we piled into the cafeteria. The lunch ladies carried trays of squared pizza to ravenous hordes. Baked bologna sandwiches were quickly discarded, and food was traded like currency. At one of the less populated sections of the long tables, Ethan sat completely engrossed in his blocky game gear. A couple of the younger kids peeked over his shoulder while he played away as they passed around crude yet colorful Tiger games to each other. I sat across from him and took out the old gray brick of a Game Boy that lay within my jacket. Ethan looked up at me just for a moment. The brightness of the full-colored screen flickered in his eyes as he smiled at me. "Hey, Glade. Doing anything fun over spring break?" I shook my head as I powered on my Game Boy, squinting at the monochrome screen, adjusting it ever so slightly to avoid the annoying glare. "No, Mom's working again. I think she's having the sitter come over." "Oh, the one from the soda fountain? Dude, she's kinda hot." I let out an annoyed huff and kicked his foot hard enough to make him yelp and shoot me a dirty look. I flashed him a satisfied smirk and went back to stacking pills on Dr. Mario. Although it was hard to focus with the constant ding of Sonic collecting coins from Ethan's side of the table. He took a moment to dig into his Batman lunchbox and start assembling his little pizzas from the packed plastic tray. I meticulously unfolded the foil strangled sandwich and raised an eyebrow. "Your mom lets you have those Lunchables?" Ethan looked up quizzically at me as he wiped his sweatpants with sauce-stained fingers. "Your mom doesn't?" I shook my head in between bites. "No, said it wouldn't help me grow." Ethan offered a shrug and only said, "Weird," before plopping the processed disc in his mouth. Part of me wanted to know how he convinced his parents to actually let him have those, but something told me it wouldn't lead anywhere. The bell tolled in a shriek as we scrambled out like a kick tie to the playground. I followed Ethan out as he held his prized console under his arm like a rolled umbrella. He led me to the dome abomination of climbing bars. Its limbs almost infected the entire sandpit, besides the swing sets. He dared me to race into the top. I smiled and accepted his challenge. Unfortunately for him, only being able to use one hand proved to be his downfall. I huffed and puffed, but sat triumphant. Ethan climbed up shortly after with a glum expression. "See? My mom was right about what those Lunchables would do," I chided with a swift laugh. Ethan's crestfallen expression melted away into his own chuckle. "Maybe, but anyways, I was thinking, you want to come over to my house for the weekend?" he offered, turning to me. "My dad bought me all this cool stuff and, well, I wanted to show it to you." "Showing up as usual then," I said with a snort. He shook his head rapidly. "No, it's just more fun when you're there. Mom and Dad are always so busy." I gave him a sympathetic nod. "As long as it doesn't involve your trampoline again, sure. Just need to phone my mom after we get out." Before I knew it, the bell rang again, signaling the end of lunch and of the school day altogether. The denizens of the playground let out a cheer and dashed back inside for their bags. Ethan and I quickly found our bikes and set out past the lines of idling minivans and pickups that lined the front of the school. We rode past the muddied fields, once thriving with alfalfa, now dotted with covered hay bales. Old Mr. Wentworth waved to us from his John Deere as it chugged along, loading bales into his trailer. The scattered houses and empty fields became our only backdrop until we got close to the main street. We pedaled into the half-occupied strip mall. Hanging above the rest was a single arched crimson K. Peeling shopping carts flowed in and out of the sliding doors like clockwork. We sloppily put up our bikes and walked in, still wearing our school bags. The store was tired and looked like they hadn't been redecorated since the 70s. The fatigued shelves were half-stocked with off-brand sodas, knockoff bag cereals, and cheap box pool floats. Wired bins filled with bargain NES games and made-for-TV VHS movies dotted every walkway. The overtly bright hanging lights only made it plain how scuffed the concrete floor really was. Cobbled together bargain signs hung above in chains. Bland monotonous jingles never stopped from the tinny speakers overhead. We shuffled to the corner cafe in the store. Our eyes drew to the spinning blades of bright red and blue liquid in the icy machine. The colored tiles under our feet creaked as we stood in line behind worn-out parents and young couples. Sad-looking pizza remained under the heat lamps as name-brand signs suffocated the sterile walls. Backlit signs with pinned letters and questionable photos hung above. The sound of a deep fryer bubbling away like it would never end. When it's finally our turn, Ethan set out a wad of wrinkled bills on the counter before I could react, despite my initial protests. The young cashier working alone picked through the mismatched bills with her chipped painted nails. Before finally pouring us 2 drinks, we sat down nursing our sugar-laden paper cups. Ethan smiled smugly at me as he fiddled with his red straw. "I'm paying next time," I said with a grumble. "As if," he responded snidely and stuck out his tongue at me. I rolled my eyes and withdrew my gaze from him and looked out to the rest of the store. My eyes settled on something that struck out from the rest of the crowd. An out-of-place form stood in the store. The first thing that caught my attention was the way he dressed. He was wearing a plain bathrobe that looked like it came out of a Sears catalog. The same kind any dad would wear to grab the newspaper from the driveway. The man looked ordinary, unremarkable almost. His feet were shoeless and muddy, like he had been walking for miles. Normally I would chalk it up to the strange people you see in Kmart sometimes, but this time I couldn't. He didn't move. He only stood in place. The man's expression was blank, like he was deep in thought. He stared at a shelf, but I noticed it was completely empty. His eyes didn't move like they were scanning price tags. They remained motionless. I didn't know if he was there the entire time or if he had just walked in. I couldn't even tell if he was breathing. His chest and shoulders never rose or fell. His skin was paler than the other people, like he had been outside in the cold for too long. The stranger wore a deep 5 o'clock shadow, like he had forgotten to shave that morning, and his hair was unkempt like he had just rolled out of bed. Parents quietly ushered their kids away, shooting nervous glances at the strange man. The aisle became deserted as everyone avoided the walkway, like looking at it would be like staring at the sun. From the cash registers, a man in a button-up shirt with a pager clipped to his belt approached cautiously from a distance. He smoothed over his comb-over and put on his best customer service smile. "Can I help you find something, sir?" The man in the bathrobe didn't respond. He didn't even look at the manager, like he hadn't heard him. The manager's smile faltered and he rubbed a hand over his chevron stash. He lowered his voice a little and asked something else. Are you okay?" Again, the man didn't respond. The manager chewed at his lip but didn't have a chance to say anything else. Without even a single gesture of acknowledgement, the odd man turned and started to walk out the door. I quickly noted his gait more than anything else. He didn't have the sure stride of a young man. He had the limp of an older man whose body had already started to give up on itself. We all watched him leave. Neither me nor Ethan said anything. My friend just stared at the plastic counter and hoped he would go away. The manager sighed when the man in the bathrobe finally left. He withdrew to one of the service counters and started to dial on the corded phone. I looked down at my hand. The red icy was lying there, completely untouched and already melting. I should call my mom," I half muttered as I dug into my bag. I yanked out the lint-covered calling card and smoothed it out a little with my thumb. I grabbed another laminated card that my mom made me get with her phone number on it. Ethan nodded a little as I scampered off to the payphones. I lifted up the receiver and was immediately greeted by a robotic woman's voice bidding me to type in my calling card number. I punched it in and squinted at my mom's neat cursive-like handwriting, doing my best to decipher it. I punched in her number and laid my back against the wall as it rang. I heard my mom's tired voice over the receiver.
Hello?
"Hi, Mom," I mumbled to her.
Oh, hey, sweetie. You at Ethan's house?
"No, I'm at the Kmart with him. Can I stay over at his house for the weekend?" I asked a little hesitantly.
That's fine, as long as Ethan's parents are okay with it. Do you need a ride back home?
I didn't answer at first. My eyes wouldn't leave those sliding glass doors. I waited for him to limp back in with those blank eyes, but he never did.
Clyde?
My mom asked with a hint of concern flickering. "Sorry, yeah, if that's okay," I said, stumbling over my words a little.
Alright, getting ready for work, but Miss Casey's coming over to watch your sister. I'll let her know to pick you up, okay?
"Thanks, Mom," I said shortly, before we made our goodbyes and I hung up the phone. I walked back over to Ethan and told him who was picking us up. He seemed to perk up a bit at that, seemingly forgetting what he just saw. After what felt like only minutes later, the sitter's beat-up Buick pulled into view. Me and Ethan made our way outside, dragging our bikes alongside us. The sitter stepped out of the station wagon and gave us a two-fingered wave. "Hey, Twerp and Company," she remarked with a smirk as she pulled her aviators up. Her dark eyeliner was already smudged as usual. "Hi, Miss Casey," I said with a smile, more than glad to be taken away from here. Casey leaned casually on her car and thumbed behind her. "Throw those bikes in the back. Don't worry about scuffing anything." Ethan stared at her a bit longer than what was considered polite before following me as we dumped our bikes in the trunk. Ethan climbed into the back seat, but I didn't follow. The high schooler shoved the bikes a bit further back to make sure the door actually closed. It started out of nowhere. One moment I was standing there thinking about what I would play on Ethan's Super. Then I was fighting back tears I didn't even know I was ever holding. My feet moved without thinking. I lurched towards her. My arms wrapped around her. My hands clenched the denim of her lined black jacket. I rested the side of my face against her ministry shirt. I felt Casey tense almost immediately. She took a moment to recover before awkwardly rubbing an arm against my back. She pulled back and gave me a concerned look. "Hey, you okay?" she asked carefully. "Mm-hmm," I mumbled with a shrug. She didn't seem very convinced, but she didn't press me any further. She ruffled my hair once and said, "Come on, let's get you home." She nudged me to the wood-paneled Buick. We settled into the leather back seats. The scent of menthol and artificial pine filled my nose. I glanced over to see a cheap car wash air freshener dangling from her mirror. Casey sat in the driver's seat. She fed a plain CD labeled in blue Sharpie into the aftermarket player. A distorted scream suddenly tore through the speakers and made the seats shake. Pounding drums and a chugging guitar vibrated the paneled walls. We jumped in our seats before Casey reached for the volume dial with a sheepish smile. All ladies passing by with shopping bags in hand cast disapproving glares at the young woman in the front seat. Casey's painted black nails tapped on the steering wheel to the music. The sitter's eyes drew to the rearview mirror. Her gaze settled on me just for a moment before she put the car in drive and sped off. I leaned my face against the cold window, feeling the warmth from my skin be stolen from me. I closed my eyes and felt the car rock me in place as it drove along. I looked out that scraggly field of winter wheat at the corner just before the turnoff to my neighborhood. The short stems of gray and green poking out from the patches of snow rippled in the thawing air. In a short time, Casey pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. We went inside and my mom was fussing with her tote bag. The edge of her badge peeked out from the puffy jacket. My little sister sat on the floor too close to the TV. The bus had already dropped her off. The TV played PBS all day without end. Mom wouldn't let me watch Ren and Stimpy when Emma was around. On the TV, LeVar Burton carried out a plate of hot dogs and hamburgers to a patio grill in a manicured backyard with his dog following behind him. A woman's voice with a nursery-like cadence read Martha Speaks over scratchy art. The lab wandered around the neighborhood, his tail wagging as he greeted each of the neighbors like his own little morning ritual. A disembodied voice claiming to be Luke the dog voiced his every thought. I sped off to my room and dumped out my school bag and started to repack it with Batman pajamas, Game Boy cartridges, batteries I took from the TV remote, and half-folded Nintendo Power Mags. I dug around for my linking cable before eventually finding it and zipping it up in my bag. I wandered back into the living room with my bag over my shoulder. Ethan awkwardly sat on the couch, not making eye contact with Emma. Casey sat in the nearby armchair, lazily flipping through some illustrated horror magazine with faces that had too many teeth glaring at me. "Your hair looks cool," Ethan remarked randomly. The thin blades of the setting sun made the burgundy streaks in her raven hair glow a sickly red. Thanks," she replied plainly with a raised eyebrow, not looking up from the pages. I rolled my eyes a little and settled my gaze on the CRT for a minute. It had switched to some short news segment, much to my sister's dismay. A well-put-together man in a pressed brown suit spoke calmly from a desk about a welfare check or a missing person report, but I didn't really pay much attention. I eventually dragged Ethan away before he could say anything else stupid. Mom tied her hair in the mirror by the door. She looked over at me. "Have fun at Ethan's. I'll probably be at the console, but page me if you need me." I nodded and gave her a short hug before leaving with all my stuff. The bike ride to Ethan's house wasn't long, only being a few streets away. Ethan's house always looked like a palace to me. My house was only one story and had just enough room for the three of us. His house even had a pool and a separate den with its own TV. He never had to worry about his mom kicking him off the couch to watch the news like I did. We left our bikes in the driveway and Ethan led the way up to his porch. He slid his home key and we heard a soft click of the door unlocking, but the door opened only a crack before stopping dead. My friend sighed and called out for his mom. A chain jingled from the other side as another key was fed into the deadbolt lock. The door slid open and his mom greeted us with a smile at the threshold. "Hi, Clyde. You can set your things down in the den. We'll be going out to the Bear for dinner tonight." "Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," I said, almost hearing my mom's voice reminding me to formally address Ethan's parents. We hung up our coats and wiped off our shoes before laying claim to the den. The room was crowded with beanbags and oversized couches. A large fireplace of masoned stone bricks occupied an entire wall. Above it hung a plaque with a pair of moose antlers from a bull Ethan's dad shot a couple years ago. Roosting on the mantel was a painted drake of carven basswood. The mallard's green head stared at us with its beady eyes as we entered. Ethan wasted no time to fish the Genesis out of a crowded shelf of cords from the wooden entertainment center and started to set it up. It would have helped, but honestly, I didn't even know how to set one up. When he finished, we sank into the beanbags, feeling its mass bind our bodies. Ethan booted up Golden Axe and tossed me a controller. We cleaved our way through the waves of blade-wielding enemies in the first couple of stages. We bickered about who got the dragon. After 2.5 rounds of rock, paper, scissors, I eventually got the privilege of having the beastly mount to myself. Of course, this only emboldened Ethan to steal all the power-ups he could. In return, I would accidentally breathe fire on him and place the blame purely on my ignorance of the controls. Even though it only felt like we had been playing for half an hour had drifted away from us. Mrs. Crawford poked her head in and told us to get our shoes on and our coats. Ethan's dad gazed at us as we put our shoes back on from his recliner with a neatly folded newspaper on his lap. He smiled wryly at me and remarked, "I know it's probably your least favorite thing, but we're having pizza tonight." I let out a half-amused huff as a dad joke and smiled politely. "Yes, Dr. Crawford." Ethan's dad led us to his pride and joy in the driveway, a dark emerald Impala that Ethan had bragged about to the older middle school girls many a time. I climbed into the leather seats as Ethan's parents traded small talk with me to the best of their ability. I looked across my seat. Ethan was looking out the window and not even paying attention to the noise around him. A part of me wanted to know why he hadn't said anything the entire car ride, but I didn't want to be rude to Ethan's parents. I made a mental note to ask him about it later. I craned my head to gaze out the tinted window. A wide building with many eyes stood out far from the parked car. The tall crimson roof hinted at the restaurant's old identity under Pizza Hut. Backlit vinyl letters across the windows read Hungry Bear Pizza. Double glass doors swallowed us whole as they swung open. The crowded booths spread out like a maze with mosaic glass lamps hanging over every table. Waitresses in polo shirts carried pitchers of root beer and lagers to tables of soccer kids and bored parents. Dusty plastic plants huddled away in forgotten shelves. Ethan's dad took out his wallet and handed us a $20 bill and told us to share it. We thanked him and dashed off to the arcade room. We dodged old ladies with their walkers ambling to the salad bar. A simple paneled door was the only thing that separated us from the game room. The arcade cabinets all blasted out their symphony as tiny hands worked the joysticks and buttons. The change machine spat out a tide of freshly minted quarters that we did our best to equally distribute into our loose pockets that now jangled with each step. My gaze was drawn to the quarter-fed candy machines. One row only had gumballs, runts, and Mike and Ike's. The other housed plastic canisters with cheaply made toys stuffed inside. I decided for a moment before feeding the runts machine a coin. The faded top hat of the sun-bleached Wonka logo stared at me. I held out my palms and let the vaguely fruit-shaped candy fill my hands. I idly chewed on mouthfuls as we perused our options. The aggressively fake flavor banana, cherry, and chalk filled my mouth. I felt a wave of dismay when I saw the newer Area 51 machine crowded with kids in grass-stained cleats. Things with too many limbs exploded into piles of gore and bones, to excitable cheers as other kids observed it like a headsman's blade at work in a town square. Ethan pointed out the unoccupied machine of Sunset Riders. The arcade was adorned with the shapes of gruff cowboys on horseback staring out at the sunset over a valley. We shoved in our quarters as the machine flickered a blue screen with the FBI seal front and center. It had text below I only glanced at. "Winners don't do drugs," it read plainly. I wasn't even sure what they looked like, only that everyone told us never to use them. The characters' intro screens passed quickly as we shot down waves of outlaws, their bodies dramatically flying back like it was a spaghetti western. We only managed to make it past the first two bounties before we were trampled to death by a stampede of steers. I considered starting over again with a fresh set of quarters, but my attention drifted to Ethan. The bright colors of the desert sands lit up his face. "Who do you think it was?" I asked suddenly, leaving context to the wind. "Huh?" He looked over at me confused. "That weird guy at the store." I elaborated. Ethan cast his gaze down, fingers circling the input button absent-mindedly. "I don't know. My dad said old people forget things and act weird sometimes. He didn't look like a grandpa to me. He looked like a teacher." Ethan shook his head and squeezed the joystick like it was a stress ball. "My dad would know. He knows everything. He's a doctor." I remained silent for a moment before asking my final question. "Is that why you're quiet now?" Ethan didn't look at me as he dug into his pocket from our quarters. "I don't know," he remarked flatly, clearly wanting me to drop it. I let out a soft sigh and followed his example. I cast a gaze at the star-patterned carpet. Faint soda stains darted the floor. We wandered around the rest of the arcade and played what we can find until Ethan's mom waved us back to the tables for pizza. We stuffed our faces as I tried to block the man's dead eyes from my mind with greasy pizza and root beer. I thanked Ethan's parents for taking me out to eat, and they smiled and remarked how I was such a polite young man, and I was clearly a dispatcher's son. We busied ourselves with our wings and pizza. Gentle reminders from the adults about our table manners became background noise. Ethan seemed to want that fancy Neapolitan hot fudge sundae, but Mrs. Crawford assured him she got a big tub of huckleberry ice cream at home. It seemed agreeable enough for him to quit tapping the brightly designed picture on the dessert menu. A stack of neatly folded greenbacks left on the bill was our only farewell. We piled back into the car and sped back to Ethan's house. The Impala ambled into the driveway. The Crawfords lazily slipped out and started to walk back to the porch. I followed them not far behind as Ethan peppered his parents with questions he already knew the answer to. The freezing wind fell silent as shadows lengthened under amber streetlights. Before I shut the front door, I looked out across the street and wish I hadn't. Across the street on an empty driveway was the stocky form of a dog. Its eyes were aglow from the porch light. Its dark brown coat and floppy ears made it plain to me that it was a lab. I expected it to wiggle its body and excitedly dash over to me for attention, but it didn't move. Its eyes never left me. I first thought it was some kind of feral dog or maybe a barn dog, but its coat was too clean, too brushed, its body too well fed from a regular diet of treats and table scraps. Fog from its snout curled around its muzzle as it remained still as a mannequin. It didn't pant or even open its maw. The dog only breathed steadily like it was a ventilator. I tightened my grip on the doorknob and slowly stepped inside and locked the door behind me. It was just a dog after all. It wasn't uncommon to see a dog wander around the neighborhood. Most people didn't have fenced backyards, but its stillness, it was all wrong. I pushed it out of my mind as I wandered into the kitchen, passing Ethan's parents lounging on the floral couch, watching Dayline NBC about someone going missing on a hiking trip. Ethan had already raided the freezer for the prized ice cream. Bowls were arranged on the counter as he piled messy scoops into his own and dumped a healthy dollop of chocolate syrup onto it. He turned to me and slid over a tub of huckleberry ice cream to me. I filled up my own bowl as Ethan chattered away about something I was half listening to. "Do you know who lives across the street?" I asked suddenly, just as he was about to start talking again. He gave me a puzzled look. "Mr. Mueller, why?" I saw this dog on his driveway." Ethan stared at me with an expression I didn't quite like before turning his attention back to the bowl of ice cream. "He doesn't have a dog," he half mumbled as he dug into his makeshift sundae with his spoon. Before I could say anything else, he walked off towards the den. I don't think I would get anything else from Ethan, as he already seemed bored with my line of questioning. I followed him with my own bowl nestled on my palms. Between losing to Ethan on Mortal Kombat and cycling tape after tape into the VCR, bowls of melted ice cream were emptied as Ethan dug into his collection for things to occupy us. The night only drew further in as the hours burned away in front of the CRT. The muted ticks from the hallway grandfather clock crescendoed at the hour's end. Bells and chimes filled the house as it emitted the toll of 12. Almost on cue, Mrs. Crawford appeared in the doorway, already in her nightgown with her hair down. "Don't stay up too late, okay, kids?" she reminded us with her arms crossed. "Okay, Mom," Ethan said, half distracted while watching The Simpsons. His mom shuffled off in her slippers, leaving us alone. Not long after, Ethan drifted off into sleep on the couch with a blanket wrapped around him. I flickered through the late-night channels in boredom, the glow of the TV being the only light in the den. A commercial played that made me stop surfing the channels. A priest stood by a pulpit. A stained glass window, the only source of light. The priest delivered a fiery sermon about hell, describing it as a prison for lost souls to ominous church music. His voice echoed for all to hear as flames and footage of doom played over his sermon. The pixelated behemoths of stone brick masonry spiraled towards the crimson sky as creatures of horns and teeth slithered. Like a flash, it was all over as the TV suddenly switched to a dry announcer reading off a script, wishing everyone a good night. The broadcast suddenly switched over to stock footage of those famous places in DC my teachers have on posters. The semi-transparent American flag waving on the screen as a choir sang the anthem. When the voices went silent, all that remained was colored bars and a muffled static writhing in the screen. I took one last look around me, glancing at the lace curtains, expecting to see a shadow cast over the window, but there was nothing. A beam above me creaked like the house was exhaling. I finally shut off the TV, closed my eyes, and let the fatigue embrace me. The sound of a door slamming shut tore me out of my dreams. My heart pounded as I leapt to my feet. My hazy vision settled on Ethan's mom trudging in with 2 gallons of milk from the morning delivery. I grumbled as I chastised myself for startling so easily. I plopped back into the couch. Ethan's snoring stirred a steady ire within. I tossed a pillow at him, which only earned an annoyed mumble from him. The glow from the morning flooded through the windows. I tried in vain to sleep in, but I gave up and reached for the remote instead and switched it to Fox. The morning cartoons were on, which seemed to be enough to wake Ethan as he groggily watched the screen. The Warners chased the shrink around the studio lot to a catchy song. The explosive ads loudly shouting about new games and super soakers barged in. I tuned out what I could and turned to Ethan. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked. Ethan contorted his body in the beanbag. "No? Why?" I shrugged dismissively. Nothing. Just wondering." I looked towards that curtained window. I couldn't stop myself from gazing outside. I inched forward and slowly peeled the curtains away and peered out across that street once again. The dog was gone, like he had only been a figment of my dreams. The driveway now housed a well-kept Ford diesel truck. An old man sat alone on the porch. A thick cigar was tucked in between his teeth. He pulled a brown work jacket around his frame. A sun-bleached Winchester hat and duck camo was pulled low over his brow. The stitching had already lost its luster years ago. An empty rocking chair sat next to him and looked meticulously cared for, like it had just gotten a new coat of paint. A crocheted blanket was neatly folded across the armrest. The glow from the smoldering tobacco flickered in the rising sun. Mr. Crawford's car pulled into the street and parked in the driveway. Ethan's dad got out with 2 plain cartons from the donut shop in town. He offered away the Misty Mueller across the way and received a short nod from the old man. His dad bustled inside and jovially announced that he had brought donuts. We both sprang up from the beanbags and pursued the confectionaries to the kitchen table. "Leave some bear claws to your mother," he reminded Ethan before we could open the boxes. Ethan's mom smiled at us gently from across the kitchen counter as she filled 2 mugs from the coffee pot. The 2 boxes of donuts were laid out on the dining room table with a pitcher of orange juice and napkins flanking it. We both took our share of our sugar load and hurried back into the den to keep watching the morning cartoon. Ethan, of course, grabbed the donut with the most colorful sprinkles, much to my dismay. We lazily flipped through channels and burned the morning away to the best of our ability. Once the morning cartoons had finished their course, my friend turned to me with a smile. "Want to see something cool?" I nodded and he smiled wider. "Come on, I'll show you." He led me to the crowded garage, suffocated with Sharpie-labeled boxes. Ethan reached behind his dad's workbench and pulled out something I can only feel envious of, a Daisy BB gun. Ethan grinned gleefully as he posed with his Model 25. Cool, huh? Want to test it out? Sure, I replied excitedly. This new experience filled me with a newfound curiosity. He grabbed a tin of metal BBs and dashed out of the garage. Ethan's dad glanced up at him from the newspaper as he sat in his recliner. The big TV droned on in the background. You gonna go shoot cans with that? Ethan bobbed his head a few times and his dad leaned back and nodded in approval. Alright, just don't be shooting any birds or near the neighbors. Okay, Dad. His dad adjusted his feet and flipped through the newspaper as we walked past Mrs. Crawford chattering away at the kitchen from the wall phone while she paced with the cord pulled to its limits. We stepped out into the wide deck overlooking the covered pool. I hardly saw him use it, and it only seemed to collect mosquitoes and leaves for most of the year. The dreaded trampoline huddled nearby that had gifted many bruises and mishaps over the years. Ethan set up various cans and bottles for us to plink. He eagerly loaded up the Daisy and shot down the first can. He let me try a few times. The pump was awkward at first for me to use, but I eventually got the hang of it. Out past the edges of the manicured green grass of his backyard, a line of barbed wire separated a farmer's field. The prairie was patchy and brown in the early thaw. A mischief of magpies hopped around and pecked at a covered bale of silage. The dark shape of a crow dropped down on top of the bale. The magpies scattered into the wind with annoyed squawks. The larger bird pecked a few times at the feed below it before settling its gaze on us as we struck down more bottles. The bird took off and flew closer to us. When it settled on a new perch on the old cottonwood, I noticed how large it really was. Its heavy wings whooshed, and the barren branches dipped under the weight. It was much larger than any crow I'd ever seen. Its chest too broad, its wings too wide. The raven ruffled its throat feathers as it tilted its head and observed us carefully. Ethan looked up as he inserted a newly loaded tube in. That bird's huge, he muttered, and I offered a nod of agreement. The crack of the BB gun not even bothering it at all. It let out a series of strange-sounding clicks and knocks from its angular beak. It preened itself for a moment before rubbing its beak against the nearby branch, completely stripping it of the soft green buds, one by one. Ethan preoccupied himself with hitting the furthest can. The corvid went still and raised its head to the sky. It let out a sound that was normally just a background noise, as unremarkable as someone clearing their throat before speaking. It let out the sound of a man's dry cough. Ethan went still and turned around slowly with a puzzled look on his face. Was that? He wasn't able to finish his sentence as the trees thrashed violently as the raven suddenly took off. The large bird quickly summited the roof and disappeared behind the house. Ethan stared at me for a second. He then turned and started to pack away his little rifle. Maybe we should go inside for a bit, he half mumbled, and I silently agreed and followed him back inside. He tucked the weapon back in its original spot and stared at a dusty splitting axe resting against the workbench. You wanna grab some pop from the drugstore? I nodded quickly, liking the idea of being away from the house for a little bit. We put on our coats in the mudroom and gathered our bikes. Our pedals carried us through the winding roads all the way down to the drugstore on the corner. A short line of pickup trucks were parked just outside the brick-and-mortar building along the sidewalk. Neon signs were plastered across the wide windows, reading Ravenwood Drugs. The wind howled, carrying the scent of rain as we stowed our bikes. I looked up to see a line of ashen gray clouds methodically descending upon the skyline. We pushed our way through the glass door, the bell chiming behind us. One of the girls Casey hangs around with leaned on the counter by the register. She idly chewed on some gum and filed her nails. The blonde smiled and waved at us with one hand. The wire racks of magazines and greeting cards spun ever so slightly under the fan above. The obnoxious sound of the malt machine whining from the soda fountain drew us to the counter. We brushed past shelves of cough syrup and toothpaste and sat down along the row of bolted stools. Emma sat in the furthest stool away. She idly kicked her feet as they hung off the floor, crayon in hand as she worked dutifully on a small pile of Barbie coloring sheets. A Shirley Temple with extra cherries bubbled away in a tall glass beside her. She seemed content to ignore my presence, as usual. Casey faced away from us as she worked the machine. She looked over her shoulder and flashed a smile, her scrunched ponytail bobbing in place. "Hey, you two. Be with you in a sec," she called out as she talked over the machine's clamor. She poured the contents of the metal mixing cup into a fluted glass and stuck a large spoon into the metal cup. She set both on the counter in front of an old man in a Stetson. He looked up from his newspaper and thanked her. He gazed out the window and squinted at the approaching clouds. "Weather's turning," he half mumbled before taking a sip from the vanilla malt straw. Casey wiped her hands on her short apron and turned to us. Her new band shirt caught my eye almost instantly. The dark shirt was covered in strange symbols, interlaced with skulls and spikes. Stylized letters spelled out Celtic frost. It looked like something from the levels of doom. I asked for a root beer float, and Ethan ordered a chocolate float. He murmured something about his dad liking them when I gave him a strange look. Casey mixed all the syrups in the glasses and stirred in the soda water from the jug. She scooped in some ice cream and set out both glasses on saucers in front of us. I spooned out some foam from the glass and brought out my Game Boy. I fussed with unraveling the linking cable for a minute before nudging Ethan to link up. He took out his own Game Boy and powered it up. We competed against each other in Tetris, racing to stack blocks in neat rows. The floats melted as daylight burned away. Just as Ethan was about to gloat over his victory, a new form sat down at the counter. The sound of heavy boots and keys jingling announcing the new arrival. "Hey, Clyde." A familiar voice greeted me. I turned to see Aunt Jan still in her gray and blue patrol uniform, the sheriff's star still shining on her jacket. She adjusted her duty belt as she pulled down her tinted aviators to smile at me. "Hi, Aunt Jan," I said warmly, feeling a little more at ease with her presence. "Staying out of trouble, young man?" she said with a smirk as Casey had already set a mug down and started filling it with coffee without being asked. "For now," I replied, feigning my best evil grin. She chuckled and shook her head. "You always were a handful to babysit." The deputy stirred in some sugar from the shaker. A slice of flathead cherry pie with a dollop of cream was set out beside the steaming mug. "Maybe a little," I admitted with a sheepish smile. "He still is these days," Casey added with a toothy grin as she scrubbed off the flat-top grill. I let out a long sigh of defeat and buried my sorrows in ice cream and root beer. I emptied the glass and felt Jan's hand ruffle my hair and remind me to be nice to my sister. The thump of her boots drew further away until they only became a memory. Ethan finally spoke up after being uncharacteristically quiet for once. "I didn't know she was your aunt." I shrugged. "She's not, but she's been around as long as I can remember." Ethan nodded a little and suggested we bike around town a bit before it started to get dark. I agreed, and we spent the rest of the afternoon biking in circles around empty parking lots and finding the best hills to speed down. The sun slowly started to wane across the sky, until the dull orange haze from the streetlights signaled for us to bike back. The sickly gray clouds only seemed to darken further with the sun's retreat. The growing wind carried sparse leaves through the air as we pedaled into the gravel driveway of Ethan's house. Mrs. Crawford was already setting out the plates on the table when we came back inside. We sat down before we could say anything else. She started to pile our plates with helpings of spaghetti and meatballs, with some Caesar salad on the side we only tolerated for the croutons. Dr. Crawford's pager chirped on his belt just as he poured himself a glass of milk from the pitcher. He let out an annoyed sigh and squinted at the screen. He stood up from the table and dialed the number on the kitchen phone. He spoke in a hushed whisper, made eye contact with his wife, and mouthed something, but I couldn't read lips. "Alright, I'll be down there as soon as I can. Just see if you can talk her into going with them." He hung up the phone and started to fuss with a leather doctor's bag while shaking his head. Mrs. Miller fell down the stairs again. Won't let the ambulance take her. She just keeps asking for me. She's gonna break a hip at this rate. Mrs. Crawford grumbled as she swirled a glass of wine. He nodded in exhausted agreement as he started to walk out the door with his bag in hand. "I'll be back later," he said before closing the door behind him. The grandfather clock began to tick a little louder than before as the three of us ate our dinner in a newfound silence. Ethan's mom cleared our dishes and busied herself over the soapy water in the kitchen sink. Once again, we found ourselves in the den, only this time, Ethan had something else to show me. From a small bin of old NES cartridges, he pulled out a game genie with bright letters reading Video Game Enhancer. We set up the Super and slotted in Super Mario World. We flipped through all the different stacks of code booklets we got from the book fair, spending some time punching in the sequences of numbers and letters for each cheat code. We took turns passing the turbo controller to each other. At first, we started simple, infinite lives and not losing power-ups. We escalated to making the plumber fly around on the screen and turning him into strange colors. Ethan's mom poked her head into the den with her purse over her shoulder. "I'm gonna go to the store real quick. The deadbolt key's in the kitchen if you need it. Don't enter the door to strangers, you know that." She reminded him, and Ethan let out an exasperated, "Okay, Mom," without taking his eyes off the screen. She let out a sigh and swung the door open. The sound of rain softly pelting the front patio flowed from the open doorway. The double click from the front door's locks as they turned in place, and the hum of her car leaving the driveway signaled her farewell. Ethan laughed as this new code was turning Mario entirely red and making his body contort and flex unnaturally in place. I decided to stand up and walk to the kitchen for an ice cream sandwich. The only light in the house came from the den in the kitchen. The rain's onslaught increased its volume as it assaulted the roof with a steady hum. I walked back towards the den, but something made me stop. Something that wasn't there before stretched as a shadow across the floor. I wanted to think it was just paranoia, but my doubt started to burn away when the shape from the porch light shifted ever so slightly. I inched closer to the door and put my eye to the peephole and gazed out at the porch. I felt my heartbeat start to pound in my chest. In the rain and the uncertain glow from the front light, a man in a bathrobe stood on the porch. I felt my chest tighten like a noose when I recognized his face. In his wrinkled hands, he held an ordinary splitting axe. The downpour pelted him and soaked his messy hair, but he didn't seem to care. His mouth hung open like he had forgotten how to close it, but he didn't say a word. His glassy eyes stared forward blankly, bloodshot like he hadn't blinked in days. The stranger casually reached for the door and turned the knob. The door only clicked but didn't open. I slid the chain into place, but I wasn't sure if it would even matter at this point. The man's eyes never left the door. I thought he was staring right into me, like he knew I was watching. I stepped back from the door towards the den, slowly, like he might be able to hear me from the other side. "Ethan! Ethan!" I whispered gravely. I felt Ethan's eyes on the back of my head, but he didn't say anything. "There's someone on the porch." Ethan mutely joined my side. Just as he was about to look through the peephole, the shadow on the floor shifted and started to drift towards the side of the house. A dark figure passed by the half-curtained windows. Ethan ran towards the kitchen, yanking the phone from its resting place. He dialed with trembling fingers as his eyes darted around. I followed him close by. Instead, my eyes drifted to the knife block by the sink. I slid in the largest knife I could find from its place and held it tightly in my pale palms. A woman's monotone voice read out a flat greeting from the phone. I looked out the back patio and I could see a silhouette from the edge of the light, patiently climbing the patio stairs. I yanked Ethan away from the phone and pulled him towards the guest room. The receiver swayed off the hook with the voice on the other end asking if we needed help. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, but I wasn't sure the flimsy interior door would even slow him down. I noticed the tall bookshelf full of heavy novels and strange little knickknacks. "Help me push it," I whispered as tears started to blur my vision. Ethan breathed shallowly next to me as we mustered up the strength to push the cumbersome bookshelf in front of the door. The hardwood floor squeaked in protest as we braced it as close as we could. The sound of glass shattering from the kitchen dispelled any notion of safety as we dove into a crowded closet. I put a hand over my mouth to silence my heavy breathing as tears rolled down my chin. I listened for any sounds from outside. The soft but deafening pitter-patter of bare feet on broken glass. From the den, I could still hear the bouncing, joyful, looping theme from Donut Plains, never ceasing. Ethan bit his own fingers hard enough to draw blood as I could hear the doorknob turn. After a short pause, the barricade trembled as something heavy and sharp struck it hard. The barrier shuddered as the axe slammed into it again. The bookshelf creaked as some of the books tumbled to the floor. I thought it would hold just for a moment, but I was proven wrong when I heard the sound of splitting wood. I clenched my teeth to stop me from screaming as the door started to split apart. The bookshelf shifted like it was being tested. I felt my head pound like a drum when the heavy bookshelf tumbled to the floor with a loud bang. My heart pounded in my ears as I watched the strange man climb through the wreckage of the door. The slits in the closet door let me see him just enough as he looked under the bed for us. His jaws never closed as he hissed like a gas mask. His cloudy eyes focused right at us as he hobbled towards the closet. I didn't realize how much taller he was than Ethan's dad until he was standing right next to us, just outside the closet. I choked down every single sound my body produced, but it didn't seem to matter. He casually reached for the door like he was about to pick out his favorite shirt. We wrapped our hands around the knob as we tried our best to keep him from opening our hiding spot. Our whimpers we couldn't hold back filled the air as we fought a cruel game of tug-of-war. Just as our hands strained from the struggle, he stopped and stood there for a second. I was about to wonder if he had given up when an axe blade crashed through the flimsy door. The closet door folded in half like a deck of cards. Screams ripped through the air, but I couldn't tell if it was me or Ethan. The man's eyes stared ahead at the hangers, but his hands reached right for us. I don't even remember doing it. My hand suddenly thrust the kitchen knife deep into the man's belly. He let out a muffled choke and crashed into a nearby nightstand, the knife still buried deep into his gut. The man's body slumped against the wall next to the broken lamp. Blood pooled down the handle. My chest heaved, but no matter how hard I breathed, I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. Ethan stared at the man's body with wide eyes, but he didn't say anything. From outside, I could hear the shrill cry of approaching sirens. We dragged ourselves to the kitchen. Ethan dug through the junk drawer for the deadbolt key. The double sliding door to the patio was completely smashed in. Blood smears and shards of glass painted the welcome mat. I thought about booking it from that way, but neither of us had shoes on. Just when I was about to ask my friend if he had found the key, I heard a shuffling from inside our previous hiding spot. A bloodied hand wrapped around the butchered door frame. Ethan let out a curse and ripped out a useless jumble of stamps and rubber bands. He grabbed a handful of loose keys and ran for the front door. Red and blue lights painted the covered windows as we rushed for the door. Ethan tried the first key and let out a cry when the lock didn't turn. The man in the bathrobe limped out of the guest room, still clutching the axe. He limped towards us, even slower than he was before. Blood droplets followed him as the dirty bathrobe dragged across the floor. I screamed at him to get the door open. Ethan slid in another. The door wouldn't click. The cold, rainy air filled our lungs as we sprinted outside. A squad car screamed into the driveway with its light bars flashing. A car door opened and the beam of a flashlight fell upon us. A man's voice that I almost recognized called out to us. The gravel dug into my bare feet as I ran towards the flashing lights. "I got kids running," I heard the deputy say into his radio. "There's someone in our house," I managed to blurt out when we got close enough to the deputy. "Where are they now?" he asked firmly, the beam of his flashlight silhouetting him. Ethan only pointed at the front door. The beam of the lawman's flashlight swung towards the patio. In the doorway, the man in the bathrobe was still there. The deputy's hand went to his holster as he spoke into his shoulder mic. "One armed with an axe, send me more cars." He looked down at us and said, "Get behind me." We huddled close behind him as his fingers unclipped his holster. He drew his pistol and whispered, "Close your eyes." Ethan shut his eyes and tried to bury his face into his jacket. I don't know why, but my eyelids refused to shut. I felt the cold rain pelt my forehead as the deputy's voice shouted across the driveway.
"Sheriff's office! Drop it now! Drop it!"
The lawman's voice cracked with adrenaline as he braced his pistol across the frame of his car door. The man didn't stop as he continued to limp forward. The hilt of the kitchen knife peeked out from the blood-stained bathrobe.
"Get on the ground! Stop right there!"
The deputy barked again as he tightened his grip on his gun. The axe blade glinted under the porch light as he carefully started to go down the stairs, but his foot never left the last step. The roar of gunfire cascaded in the night. My ears rang as screams I couldn't tell whether they were mine or Ethan's filled the air. Casings peppered the windshield and the hood of the patrol car. The pounding of the gunfire halted just for a moment with a deafening click. The deputy cursed under his breath. He racked the slide back and let it slam forward. A single unspent round skittered across the gravel. One last shot rang out. The man in the bathrobe thumped to the ground like a marionette with his strings cut. The axe tumbled down the stairs as a dark line of urine pooled down his pant leg. The deputy let out a few shaky breaths as he reached for his shoulder mic. He was out of breath like he had just run for miles. "Shots fired. Suspect down. Roll EMS." He approached the fallen man with his pistol aimed at him, still shouting commands at him as his radio squawked with half-clipped voices. The howl of more sirens approached from somewhere nearby as the deputy kicked away the axe. He turned over his limp body with his boot and reached for his duty belt. The handcuffs clicked as they snapped in place. I didn't realize how much blood there was until I saw the gaping hole in the back of his head. 3 more squad cars sped around the corner and skidded to a halt in the driveway. Responding deputies held shotguns and revolvers low as they rushed towards the house. One of the deputies stopped and turned to us, but I couldn't see who it was. A familiar voice called out to me, "Clyde." The voice of Jan seemed surreal to me now, like I couldn't believe it existed here. She clutched a 357 with the same hands she handed me poppin' hot dogs at department barbecues in the park. She holstered her revolver and started to usher us away towards her car. My ears rang, but I could hear gentle murmurs from her, but I really couldn't make out anything. Ethan couldn't stop staring at the porch, and neither could I. I don't remember what she said, but she pushed a teddy bear dressed up in a police uniform into my hands, and I squeezed it tight like my life depended on it. An ambulance drove up with its lights flashing. The crew stepped out with their jump bags and walked towards the body. The EMT knelt down and checked his pulse with 2 fingers while listening to his chest with her stethoscope. She shook her head at the paramedic standing nearby. The paramedic nodded and started to walk away, peeling off his gloves as he talked into the mic across his chest casually. "Hey Doc, Rescue 3 here. On the scene of a OES for an unresponsive male with multiple GSWs." He waited for a moment before an older voice cut through the static.
Time of death, 9:34 p.m.
"Copy that, Dr. Morris. Appreciate it." I saw the headlights from Mrs. Crawford's car cut across the light bars. The last thing I remember was the awful scream that ripped through her throat as she saw her driveway crowded with police cars and a corpse lying in her front yard. "That's enough for now, Clyde," a gentle voice said to me. I looked up across from me. Nora still sat there with a soft smile. She pushed a box of tissues across the metal table when my vision started to blur. A dull, incessant tapping filled the room. At first, I thought it was from our tape recorder, but I was wrong. From one of the tiny windows, the pitch-black form of a raven stared in. His body swallowed the moonlight as he pecked rhythmically on the window. Tap, tap, tap.